fair warning, right? It is forever. And my wife is going to do.
Being recorded.
That's right. So that should
say can be.
looks like we're good. Okay, so first thing I wanted to mention is I found this really great article in Christianity Today in the newest edition about an effort in Ghana to save the brown-eyed Etowah slippery frog. And the gentleman who's leading that charge was not getting government funding, and so he turned to churches in the area and made the appeal, and it just made me think of what Ben has been talking about in the last couple of weeks, that we can do more together, and those kind of challenges. So I printed that out. You can send it around. You can find it on... what do I want by that? You can find it on ChristianityToday.com also. And I was thinking... probably a lot of those churches that he's referring to were started by, David Mensa. So it's just kind of cool connections there. Okay, let's see. Yep, we're working. A couple of weeks ago, Joel asked me a question that started me on some research. You asked me what previous generations, in like the early church especially, if they had thought about creation care in the ways that we are. And it sat me down actually, I think might be something that I do on my sabbatical. A little bit more research on this because it's fascinating. I did not find a lot, in part because I don't have a wealth of early church resources. I don't have those mammoth volumes of ante-Nicene fathers. But what I did find, when the early church was writing about creation, they were thinking in different terms than we are, facing different challenges than we are. Most of what they were writing about or against was Gnosticism and the idea that creation in and of itself is bad. Material stuff is bad. So most of it had to do with the fact that no, God created it, it's good. So there's implications there. I did find a few. Severian of Gabala, he's not a great guy in church history, honestly. But he says, the text referring to Genesis 2 says that we should work and protect it from what? There were no thieves, travelers, or people with bad intentions. Protect it from what? From himself. And I thought, oh, this is a great, creation care kind of quote. But what he actually meant was don't sin and then lose paradise. So not quite... the care of creation that we are talking about. But then you get to Calvin. And Calvin is just so rich in this. Lots of material. Genesis chapter 2, being content with frugal and moderate use of the gifts that God has given us. We should take care of what shall remain. Suffer the ground to be injured. We should not suffer the ground to be injured by our negligence, but let him endeavor to hand it down to posterity as he received it, or better cultivate it. Let him so feed on its fruits that he neither dissipates it by luxury, nor permits it to be marred and ruined by neglect. So this is getting at the kind of stuff that we're talking about, and this isn't all. Talks about not corrupting God's creation through the abuse of things which God requires to be preserved. That's still on Genesis chapter 2. And then on Psalm 104, I'm not going to read the whole thing again, but he desires that the order which God has established from the beginning may be continued in the lawful use of his gifts. In other words, there's an unlawful way of using his good gifts. So, see, Calvin is good. Okay. But this is something I would love to spend, months researching the early church attitudes towards the gifts of creation. Yeah, Ashley.
It's been a very long time, but my college senior thesis was on the Eastern Orthodox attitudes for creation.
Yeah.
So you may want to also don't just look at Western Church, but the Eastern Church actually has a long history of...
So you've taken an impossible task and made it doubly impossible.
Well, have a bibliography.
No, that'd be great. That'd be fantastic. I did see that there was a conference coming up that was calling for papers on this topic, early church attitudes towards creation care. And there is no chance that I will have the time to write and present a paper by then. But okay, so most of what I want to do is move a little bit into the New Testament, but as kind of under the framework of dealing with questions and objections. I hope, I laid out a pretty clear case that the Old Testament really does mandate, I know I'm using strong language there, but does mandate a care for creation. It's embedded in the creation accounts. It's embedded in our role as stewards or caretakers, vice regents of creation. And then we looked at a few specific Old Testament laws that relate to caring for the earth, how you farm, how you hunt and gather, etc. So as we move into the New Testament, it's kind of under the rubric of dealing with questions and objections that I've read, I've heard, other people have shared with me regarding the call to care for the creation. And if at any point you want to stop, pause, push back, don't hesitate. I'm saying that you never have. I don't know why I felt like I needed to say that. Okay. One of the people who I will be interacting with, I won't not mention his name under every objection, is Cal Beezner. He is probably the most vocal evangelical climate change denier and head of an organization which is now called...
Something biblical sounding.
It's not anymore. It'll come to me in like 3 slides. So it's changed its name like 4 times recently in the past couple of decades. And someone sent me an interview that he just did this past week on Moody Radio. So some of the stuff that I'll be engaging is stuff I've heard from him, but it's out there in the evangelical cosmos too. One of the points that is often made is that God has, in Genesis, given us permission to use his creation, subdue it, have dominion over it, and Cal and others see virtually no limit to that permission. If I was going to label this objection, I would call it the consumeristic objection. Just consume. And Cal is very forthright in his kind of, we have unfettered access to creation. Use it. We cannot, in his opinion, use it up. If we do damage to the environment now, through our ingenuity, we will fix it later, is his mentality. It's definitely unfettered free market capitalism, profit-driven innovation, best reflects the responsible application of mankind's divinely appointed dominion mandate. Okay. So how would you respond to this? Oh, wow, that was quick, Amy.
Well, I was thinking about it as you were writing it and putting it up there. I think, God also gives rulers authority over the people that they rule. And I don't think that Mr. Beezner would say that all types of ruling is just.
Okay.
So I think that it would be fair to ask Mr. Beezner if there is a just and an unjust type of use and dominion that we can have in our rulership over creation.
Okay. I think that's a great response. Yeah, as we looked at Genesis 1 and 2, I was attempting to make the point that we ought to, as God's vice regents, rule in a way commensurate with how God would rule. And he cares greatly for his created order. So we ought to care for it as well. Good. Okay.
There's also the other small detail of sustainability.
Yes, yeah.
That it's quite likely that we are presently on a path which simply doesn't lead to an eventual stability.
Sure.
It's an unstable circumstance that we're leading at the moment.
Yeah.
So
and his idea of, well, we'll just fix it in the future through our ingenuity, makes me feel really bad for my kids. You know, if we leave them a mess and say, hey, fix it. We don't do that in any other area of life, hopefully, right? So it just seems fairly irresponsible. Jack?
I think he's wrong in saying we can't use it up. I think we can use it up. When you cut down all the trees, we're in trouble.
Okay.
So, actually, so.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, but if you, what I recall from reading, and even as a college student, the idea was you should use it up because it will speed up the second coming of Christ. That's
It's not actually Cal. I don't know who that is. Cal's a post-millennialist. So he thinks eventually we'll improve everything and usher in the golden age. But there is that stream of evangelical thinking too.
Right.
So, okay. So this one just to me is easily refuted. Another one that I have seen recently. God's covenant with Noah means that God will preserve the earth until the end of time. In other words, it will not end until God destines it to end. He's promised that through Noah, through the covenant with Noah, Genesis 9. If I was going to label this one, I would call it the Hakuna Matata. You know, no worries. We can't. It's in God's hands. He won't let it get used up or destroyed until the end. What are your thoughts?
I don't think this has to be in conflict with also preserving the earth and creating it as a just, to use your word, as a just place for everyone.
Okay.
They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I agree. False dichotomy. And just say, for the sake of argument, grant this. That doesn't mean it will be a fun, hospitable place necessarily, right? I mean, we could turn it into a dump.
The earth is a globe. It could be anything on the globe.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we can deal with this one fairly quickly. We want to live in a place where we can enjoy creation and not fight against creation and live in harmony with it. And
Ben had us.
oh, I'm sorry, Ben.
No, just one comment about a story that you know perhaps from past reading, and that is the story of Easter Island. You remember that Easter Island, a group of folks living quite well on a small island in the Pacific, were enormously creative. They made all these marvelous statues, which we think of as Easter Island typical. And then suddenly the population simply died away. It didn't die off. That is, there are still people on Easter Island, but they're living in a circumstance which is at best highly degraded. It's one where they simply managed about 300 years ago to use up all the forests, and then they lost the capability of escaping from the island because they had no way to make boats. So once they were isolated, then life simply ran downhill, so to speak.
Wow.
It exists, but it is not a flourishing life, I thought.
Yes. Yeah, we can be amazingly short-sighted, can't we? You need trees to make boats, but you used up all the trees. And okay. Another one I've made, and others have made a strong case. I'll leave it. Others, Christopher Wright is a phenomenal writer on Old Testament ethics. I think he's made a very strong case from the Old Testament that this is a mandate. You know, we ought to care. I'm using the word ought. You know, we ought to care for God's earth. Some have responded, but that's Old Testament. We have now advanced to the New Testament era. We're unhitched. We're unencumbered by Old Testament law. I'm using this word, it's from Andy Stanley, but it's got a long history in the church, going back to the heretic Marcion, who believed the God of the Old Testament was a different God than the God of the New Testament. And we're not under the law at all. I mean, you could spend weeks on our relationship to law, right? So in 30 seconds, this is the antinomian heresy, combated in the early church, still a struggle for evangelicals, I think, especially today. But the problem in the New Testament, as Paul especially points out to the law, wasn't that the law was bad, but that it was powerless. Those who walk, so the problem wasn't the law. In fact, God promises in the New Covenant that he will write the law on our hearts. And those who walk by the Spirit walk in step with God's commands. God's commands are good. Again, Paul never faults the law in the content of the law, but that it's not powerful enough to bring about perfect obedience. The law reveals God's heart, and so if the law reveals God's heart, it tells us what he loves, what he hates, and we see this all throughout the Old and New Testament. God delights in his creation. He sees it, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good. And then you get, throughout the Psalms, just these hymns of worship to the Creator of this beautiful place that we live. And God mourns for the destruction of his land. Jeremiah 9:10 is a powerful example of it. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God says, I will take up weeping and wailing for the mountains, and lamentation for the pastures of the wilderness, because they are laid waste, so that no one passes through, and the lowing cattle cannot be heard. Both the birds of the air and the beasts have fled and are gone. That is coming in response to Israel's sin. Israel has wandered away from God, and God is sending an army to destroy. So God is the one who is laying waste to the mountains through his wrath, and yet it grieves him to do it. He weeps over the desolation of his creation. I think this is a really important point. I want to just pause and dwell here, because Christianity is often characterized as the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever known. I read that this week in an article about climate change. We're so focused on the uniqueness of mankind, the uniqueness of our relationship to God, and there is a grain of truth in that if Christianity is divorced from the Old Testament, and if Christianity, I would say, is divorced from the book of Revelation. You don't read much about creation care in Paul's letters, right? It's about humans, it's about human relationships to each other, to God, not much about our relationships to the created world. But Paul isn't, the only writer, right? We are hitched to the Old Testament, and we can't forget that, neglect that.
Of course, Jesus quoted Isaiah routinely and
Yes.
often,
Yes.
and verbatim, and so it's a little difficult to see the disconnect.
Absolutely, yeah. A lot of Jesus' parables, right, are drawn from the natural world. The Sermon on the Mount makes it clear God cares about two sparrows. Two sparrows don't fall to the ground, unless our Father in heaven knows about that. So there is still this very intimate connection between God and his world and us and the world. Jack?
Matthew 5:17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them.
Yeah.
For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished.
Yeah.
That was Jesus.
Yeah, definitely.
Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah. Well done, Jack. Any others? Yeah, Amy.
And while Paul maybe didn't talk a lot about creation, he did start Romans by saying that creation points us to God, and that because of creation being able to point us to God, that we're all accountable for recognizing him.
Yes, good point.
That was
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah,
That's
and he
all.
draws on what I would refer to as natural law often. We
Yeah.
ought to know from the created order. Yeah, good. He also has something to say about why creation groans. We'll come to that
That's
in
true.
just a minute too. So, okay. Like right now. So, Creation will always be groaning under the curse. So some have, this is Paul's language from Romans 8. Creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. When does this happen? When we receive our inheritance. So this is eschatological, end times. Creation is released from its bondage to corruption, to decay. And the objection goes, and not until then. Creation will always be groaning, decaying. There's nothing we can do about it. So I would term this objection, this is the teenage angst objection. You know, what's the point? Or if you're going to say it like a teenager, what's even the point? You know,
What's even the point?
what's even the point? Or it's the Sisyphean kind of objection. You know, you're never going to get the rock up the hill. You know, so why even try?
We can say that about ourselves and our own sanctification, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're called to be
We'll never be perfectly holy, right?
Exactly.
So why try? You can say it about medicine. People are going to die. So you can say, well, then why try fixing it? You know? We can say it about relationships and marriages. Relationships are always going to be hard until sin is dealt with finally. That doesn't mean we don't care about marriages and relationships now. So a disingenuous, I think, kind of objection to creation care and stewardship. We're flying through a lot of them quick. Any thoughts here?
I was just thinking, like, good is worth fighting for, even if it's a small amount of good.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so those are fairly minor objections. Not ones I hear as often as the next few. They all come under the rubric of eschatology and environmentalism. We don't do a lot with eschatology, end times stuff here. We're not a church that is kind of obsessed with timelines and figuring out all the symbolism. And so we don't major on eschatology. But it's not unimportant. J. Richard Middleton, is a professor at Northeastern Seminary, said ethics, which we do talk a lot about, is lived eschatology. How you envision the end will greatly impact how you live in the here and the now. And different versions of eschatology have an impact on ethics, especially environmental ethics. Okay? I was going to play these two songs, but it takes too much time. There's two great songs that I think reveal a tension in our eschatology and how it relates to environmentalism. One was written, it's a Depression-era song. I thought it actually went further back than that, but it's This World Is Not My Home. I remember hearing, a Jim Reeves version of it. This world is not my home, I'm just passing through. Hold that great song in tension with another great hymn, This Is My Father's World, right? And so they're saying different things, both true, but both using the word world with a different nuance. So we have to hold those truths, not those songs, we do away with the songs, that's fine, but hold those truths. Okay, no, we can't, you're right. They're great songs. We can do away, set aside the songs, the tension we have to live in. How do we do that? One of the objections that I hear frequently is, should we even be talking about this? It takes time, it takes energy, it takes resources. Shouldn't we be more concerned about evangelism and missions? Going out and saving souls is the language that is often used. You heard this one?
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's an easy one. This is the one, Grace has gotten this one from a dear friend up in Michigan.
Okay.
And her easy response was that they're completely tied up with each other. That if souls are physically at risk, because of climate change, then that's also part of the responsibility of the church, because if they die before evangelism, then,
Okay.
or if they suffer because of greed, right?
Okay.
Of worldwide greed, then either one of those things put their souls at stake.
Gotcha. Yeah, not bad. This is one of Cal Beezner's kind of drums he likes to beat. In an interview recently, he said, where one goes to spend eternity matters much more, and it should be any reasonable human's primary concern. I think there's a nugget of truth here that we need to pay attention to and not forget. The church is in a position to do something that I would say no other worldly institution can. We are heralds of the gospel. Other groups, organizations, institutions can champion climate change and environmental stewardship, Greenpeace, and etc., right? Lots of them. Just because others can do it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I think what Amy and, or actually your daughter Grace is onto is very important. I think there's also two other things that need to be said. Never does God say, ignore some of my commands so that you can go and spend energy on other commands. The command to evangelize is an unequivocal command in the New Testament, right? But nowhere do we get, a command, well, don't spend time on pursuing holiness so that you can go and evangelize. I think these are clear commands of Scripture to care for the world. So we don't set aside a clear command of Scripture to pursue another one.
Another parallel is that previous argument that creation will always be groaning under the curse. Jesus said the poor will always be with us, right? But obviously the apostles recognized that the care of widows and orphans was important enough that they appointed deacons for the church to take care of it.
Yeah, good.
And that was filling mouths, right, and bellies.
Yep.
So I think that's a parallel to
Definitely, definitely. Good. Jane.
If we are totally ignorant of and disconnected from the current topics in the world, we're not going to be very evangelistic.
Okay. More ivory tower type Christians, disconnected from the real struggles that people are, real concerns. Yeah. Great. Ben.
It just occurs to me that we should go back and think about what it means as Christians to save souls.
Great.
What exactly are we doing when we save a soul? Let's suppose we take somebody who is the obvious target of our efforts and we save them. Okay. What have we done? Well, what we've done perhaps is to convince them that the most important thing in their life maybe be to take care of other people in the world.
Okay.
That's all right, worship God and take care of the other people in the world, including yourself, is the primary commandment. And so when you save a soul, somebody who maybe doesn't believe that, now they are indeed focused on saving souls. And how do you do that? You take care of them. And that's what we're talking about with creation care, taking care of people. So it seems to me that to separate the two is really hard.
Sure, yeah. As a theological nerd, the way I would say what you just said in jargon is you can't separate justification from sanctification.
Wow.
If you have been justified and redeemed and saved, it will have an impact on how you live and treat others, including caring for the world that sustains them and nurtures them. And yeah, Ashley.
I read that in my skin crawls, thinking more about my work internationally. I mean, the church has moved, I think, for the most part, so far away from just going out and trying to convert people in foreign lands. I think we've realized that there's a lot more to it in terms of providing for their physical well-being, or even using that as an entry point into the culture, as opposed to just the old way of going out and beating them up with Bibles and trying to teach them English and teach them the Bible.
So this really, I'm sorry, I didn't want to.
I I resound with that incredibly, like
Yeah.
the merging of humanitarian work and the gospel. It's both. You can't just save somebody's soul and not provide a clean water well, if they have dirty
Okay.
water. You gotta, it goes hand in hand.
Wow, okay. Stephen, first.
I also, throughout this discussion of this particular slide, I keep thinking about James, the book of James.
Yep.
It very clearly says, if you tell somebody, go and be saved, but you haven't given them a blanket or a cloak or
Yeah, yeah.
food, then how
Great.
have you really helped them? And, show me your faith without works, I'll show you my faith by works. So
That was going to be my conclusion to the day, so you just stole that. So.
The other thing that bothers me about this slide is I think it gives us way too much credit
Yes,
for
Oh,
the
good.
absolutely.
activity of saving souls.
True.
Yeah.
I like the way you put it earlier, that the church is a herald of the gospel.
Yeah.
God is the one who saves souls.
Sure. Okay,
So
Jack,
anyway, yeah.
I'll give you the last word on this one because I want to say something else before we move on to.
Two examples is Ron and Doris Weeks, Farming God's Way.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they use that to reach people for Christ, but they're
Sure.
also helping them raise food and stuff. And David and Brenda Mensa,
Right.
you know, the
Definitely.
stuff they've done with the fish and things.
Yep.
But they've also converted like 48 fellowships,
Yeah. Yep.
and then the hospital and the
Right.
thing, so.
Yeah, so in the end, this borders on a heresy I mentioned earlier, in a Gnostic heresy that says flesh it's bad, or at least it doesn't matter. And the only part that really matters is the internal stuff, the soul, the spirit, soul. That's what's eternal, that's what matters. The problem is that just runs against the grain of the New Testament in its entirety, right? Jesus came in the flesh to redeem humanity in the flesh. He was raised in the flesh. He was hungry and thirsty, and he promises that those who he does redeem will be raised in the flesh. So the embodiment is essential to Christian theology. Without embodiment, we have no Jesus, right? We have no hope of resurrection. So embodiment is there, and it's a key doctrine. And as several of you pointed out, this gets lived out in how the apostles do ministry, right? So this is Gnostic heresy. Yes, they're going out and they're preaching the gospel, but they're ministering to widows and orphans. They're feeding the poor. They're taking up collections to take back to Jerusalem so that they can minister to the financial needs. They care about people in their wholeness. There's an integrity to people, and people are treated in that integrity. That's important. Okay, more on eschatology, though. Oh, Craig Bartholomew, he's a great biblical theologian, writes really accessible stuff. If you see something by Craig Bartholomew in the store, buy it. And then read it, right? Don't just put it on your shelf. He said, while the New Testament's theology of place is refocused, so it's slightly different than the Old Testament. The Old Testament was focused on land between these boundaries. New Testament is just as materialist as the Old, but it's refocused. So we haven't set aside material concerns when you get to the New Testament. It's just focused through a different lens. Okay. Another aspect of our theology that needs to be thought through related to creation care is new creation. Sometimes you hear what matters. Well, sometimes you hear it's because that's what the Bible says, right? What matters is new creation. This comes in Galatians 6:15. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but new creation. Talking about us as individuals who are the first fruits of the entire new creation. Paul uses that phrase also in 2 Corinthians 5. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. And these are echoes of especially the prophet Isaiah. A lot through Isaiah 40 to 45 related to new creation. But we know these passages. We read them often in our services. Isaiah 65, for behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. And then it gets into that passage, the wolf will lay down with the lamb. And there's this beautiful envisioning of what new heavens and new earth looks like. Isaiah 66, for as the new heavens and the new earth that I make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your offspring and your name remain. So there's just this hope of new creation. But what does that mean? How new is the new heavens and the new earth? Do you remember the TV show from I remember it used to be Sunday nights because you would always watch it with the boys while I was at Connection, Extreme Home Makeover.
Yeah.
And it started, and they'd go into someone's house the house was dilapidated, and they would renovate and fix it up and make it livable. And there was a great level of continuity between the old house and the new renovated house. It looked relatively the same, but better. As the show progressed, they just tried to outdo themselves. And eventually they would just bulldoze the old house and recreate a new house. And it was, a monstrosity, a 6,000 square foot house for a retired couple, just these big things. And you're like, they can't afford to heat that now. But there's no continuity between the old house and the new house. So what's the level of continuity between this present heaven and earth and the new heavens and new earth? There are two models. One of them you could call the continuity model. And for example, one text that would lead in this direction is Colossians 1, 19 to 20. For in him referring to Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. So there's a reconciliation of all things. They're still there, they're reconciled, they're renewed. You could use the word renewal in other places. The other model is called a replacement model. This world is done away with and a new one is recreated. Psalm 102, of old you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will wear out like a garment, but you will change them like a robe. So you take them off, put them away, and put on a new robe on. In the New Testament, 2 Peter leads in this direction. The day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. So it's this melting away, the dissolution of what exists now, and the recreation of a brand new heaven and earth. Any thoughts?
I don't want to be cynical about it, but 2 Peter is absolutely correct. It turns out that in about 300 million years, the sun will indeed evolve to a diameter which is sufficient to burn up the earth. So
Okay.
he's on track.
Okay. Scientifically advanced for his age, right? Rather than debate this, we could have a whole class on which model. I am going to assume, for the sake of argument, a replacement model. What we see, what we have now is done away with, gone, and new heavens and new earth are recreated. Does that mean that I should show no care for this present earth?
Well, that passage you had on the previous slide, could you go back for just a second?
Yeah.
Peter kind of asks a rhetorical question anyway, right, on verse 11. What sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness if all these things are going to be dissolved?
Okay.
So he's not implying that we should not live lives of holiness and godliness if things are going to be dissolved. He would still challenge us to live holy and godly lives.
Okay.
You can go back to your slide. So that's
Yeah.
my response to your...
And you would say holy and godly lives includes caring for his creation. Great answer.
Because it is God-like. Isn't that what
Yeah.
godliness is?
Sure. Okay. Yep. One way that the continuity model finds its way into contemporary literature in an unhelpful way is basically the idea that we will so steward and God, the good works we do kind of just, the works of art that find their way into the new heavens and new earth. And that doesn't jive with me. So there's part of me that it does embrace this model. But not everything has to be eternal to matter, right? Sorry to break it to you, we will not be married in the new heavens and new earth. Marriage doesn't exist in new heavens and new earth. Yet, none of us would say that I should treat my marriage with contempt now. Just because it's not eternal doesn't mean it doesn't matter now. We could also point and say, in the evangelical world, some people, that was a weird qualifier, some people will ultimately be condemned. Should I care for them less now? The answer is, of course not. No. And so just because something doesn't make it into the new heavens and new earth doesn't alleviate our responsibility to care for it in the here and the now. One more passage from, still on eschatology. This is my last eschatology passage here. Revelation 11, verses 17 and 18. We give thanks to you. This is the 24 elders who are before the throne, and they're falling on their face and they're worshiping God. We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who was, or who is, and who was, for you have taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. This word is where we get the word geography, geology. It's right there. It's a different tense, but not tense. Stephen Lulich is cringing in the back. It's like, nouns don't have tense. You know better. It's actually an echo also of, I have it written down, Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51 uses the phrase the whole earth. It's eris. It is a land, world, earth word. I read 8 different Revelation commentaries this week. All of them said this is referring to God's people.
Oh.
No, strike that. 7 of the 8 said it's referring to God's people. 1 said the earth is the Lord's and the kingdom will be his, hence those who devastate the earth challenge God's rule. Like, that's right on. I want to talk to the other authors, the 7 other authors of the other commentaries, and say even if this refers to God's people, which would be bizarre use of language, how is it that this word earth comes to become so parallel to God's people that they can be used synonymously? So God cares for his people who are so connected to earth, and some of the language, that his wrath includes destroying the destroyers of the earth. That got convoluted in my head as I was trying to get it out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
The word human and humus and all those connections do exist,
They
right?
do.
Right, yeah. Okay. One more minute and then I'm done. This is a political issue. We should, as a church, avoid politics. I try to avoid politics. Over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, I have failed miserably to avoid politics. Part of it is the political culture. Part of it is I'm just angry. Part of it is everything is political now. You want to talk about marriage? It's political. You want to talk about sex? It's political. You want to talk about life? It's just everything is political. I do not want to get to the point where I'm advocating for a certain piece of legislative policy because I don't know enough. I have my opinions, but I hope you haven't heard me do that because I'm very concerned about, A, the law of unintended consequences. There's been times where I've really advocated for something and then I'm like, oh, that was great, but the unintended consequence was bad. And I don't know enough. So I hesitate to do that, but I will stand on the ground. We ought to care for God's earth. That's not a political issue. That's a biblical issue. What that looks like, I think this book has given you tremendous non-political things to do, and then I will leave it to you to think through and negotiate the political side of stuff. Okay, I think I'm done. I was going to tell the story. These are some villages in Fiji that have had to be relocated near where my parents lived because of rising sea levels.
Wow.
You can ask me about that later.
Wow.
Okay, back to Cal Beezner. Beezner? Yes, E and then I. Beezner. Theologically, we're close to being on the same page, but theology needs to be applied, and that's where I depart ways with Dr. Beezner significantly, and then the science. And I'm leaving that to Ben.
Let's spend just a couple of minutes on Beezner.
Give that to you.
Great. Dan, you are something. I love every moment of being here, and I am just overwhelmed and delighted at your questions and your responses and your deep knowledge of what is going on in your life. I think that is simply magnificent. I just want to tell a couple of happy stories, and then I'll focus one slide on Mr. Beezner, just to talk about the science of his presentation that one of the podcasts that I happen to listen to. There's some pretty exciting things going on, one of which turns out to be related to the use of the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is a pretty cool place. It's huge. It also turns out to be one of the very best places to gather solar energy. Interesting thought. Now, it's not like putting solar panels on the roof of the church here, which I assume at some point will happen, but it's pretty nifty idea to think about the idea that you might actually take the enormous energy of the Sahara Desert, which is available, and help the people who are living in North Africa and also in the eastern part of the Mediterranean to actually have a source a resource that they can then use to improve their own lives. And that is exactly what's going on right now. So rather than take charge of the technology and import it from Europe or the United States, what we are doing is working with the people in the Middle East and North Africa to be the experts. So they become the experts, and then they teach us about how it is that you do solar energy in the desert, which is really hard. That turns out then to give them access to a resource which then improves their lives enormously. So that's just one kind of a very positive story which I love to resonate with. One thing that you know about is that COP26 has now finished. There were several objectives raised, one of which is to, of course, make sure that we keep our reach net zero CO2 by 2050, which is a huge and difficult thing to do, but if we can do it, we can keep our rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees C. Also, if we can't, we're going to have to adapt to raise temperatures anyway, and then we need some money to help the poorer countries to do that. And then you're going to use government, business, and civil society to get there. And the interesting thing is that there's a good end to this story. As I mentioned to you when you asked me 2 weeks ago whether COP was a failure, the answer is no. The answer is it's not a failure. The reason it's not a failure is because nothing happens during the first 2 weeks. And then in the last days, things do begin to happen. And it turns out that one of the most important things that happened is that the US and China got together. So Mr. Xi Zhenhu and John Kerry got together and have been working for the last 6 months on this. This is not something that happened in the last 2 days. For the last 6 months, they've been working out a plan where China and the US would work assiduously together as the two major producers of CO2 in the world. More than 40% of the total world CO2 comes from us and China together. A little bit more to China than to us. But the nifty thing is that by collaborating with the Chinese on this issue, you can actually make huge progress. We're not collaborating on lots of other things for very good reasons. I'm not advocating that all things Chinese are good. That said, or that all attitudes Chinese are good, or all politics are good. But this is a place where enormous effort is now being successful. So there's something pretty exciting coming out of COP26. in addition to the fact that there's reforestation agreements that have been reached and now methane agreements worldwide. So there are several wonderful things that have happened. Okay, lots of good things are happening with regard to our young people. You know that because the young people were very active at COP26. The kinds of things that are going on are many. This is a group called ICEE, which was something that Lady had a huge amount to do with establishing. There's a group of young people here in Bloomington from different churches who are working together to do projects that have to do with helping other people, in this case, do the weatherization of homes and so forth. Well, one of the things that's happening this evening, for example, is that I'm taking a group of our Trinity folks because of ICEE and learning to work with young people. I'm taking a group of young folks out to do the lantern walk, and then after the lantern walk, we're going to begin learning how to do weatherization on several houses in our Trinity parish. So that's the kind of thing which is a good news kind of thing. Geoengineering is something which is another story which we could talk about. I have only 3 more minutes left, so I'm going to skip geoengineering, but it's a very interesting topic. My basic sense is that geoengineering is really tough. I mean, you're probably going to do research on geoengineering, but to actually implement it is always going to be difficult because you're going to have to decide who gets to say what about the Earth. And that is really hard. If I put sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere to cool it off, are the people going to be happy who are now sitting in Canada and Alaska, for example? So the answer is it's going to be really, really hard. So I would say skip geoengineering. There are all sorts of difficulties. So let's focus, final minute or two, on Mr. Carl Beezner's podcast, the one I happen to listen to. He talks about CO2, and I'd like to try to find something in common with him, because I hate to just say it's rubbish. There is a lot of rubbish, but let's focus on the things where we can agree, and then I can talk about the things where we disagree. The places where we agree are pretty straightforward, namely CO2, carbon dioxide, is indeed a natural gas. It is odorless. It's not directly toxic, that it doesn't kill us in small amounts. Right now it's about 420 parts per million, so he and I agree on that number. It is absolutely essential to life. That is, CO2 is the stuff that plants take in, and then they produce oxygen through photosynthesis. So that's absolutely correct. He talks about higher CO2 levels in the past, and he's exactly right. He quotes numbers of 8,000 to 10,000 parts per million. Turns out the real numbers are more like 2,000 to 3,000 parts per million, but I'm not going to quibble. Okay, so the answer is yes, CO2 has been higher in the past. That's place of agreement. So where are the disagreements? Well, first of all, CO2, he says CO2 is not a toxin, so it's not a pollutant. There we disagree, because actually CO2 has not only direct non-toxic effects, but it does have other effects which he fails to mention, not the least of which is that it is a greenhouse gas. It turns out to be one that absorbs infrared radiation, which you and I know from the first talk we gave. And if it absorbs infrared radiation, then of course it is raising the temperature of the Earth, and that means we have a problem, Scotty. We have to deal with that problem. And so it is odd to say that it's not a pollutant. He makes the connection with Guy Callender. In 1950, it turns out that actually people for the last 200 years have known about the impact of CO2 on temperature, and so that's a little naive and incorrect. He also says that photosynthesis stopped. It stops at 170 parts per million and did so in the 16th century. That's a bunch of rubbish. It did not stop, and the lowest level of CO2 in the 16th century was about 270 parts per million. He also says that more food grows at higher levels of CO2. That is not clear. It's clear that you get more green material, but it's not at all clear that you can actually get more crop of value. The other thing that he mentions, which is really the most important thing I will say, is that CO2 is not a primary driver, and he quotes then the sun and magnetic winds and clouds, and that's rubbish. That's simply rubbish. It turns out that none of that is correct if you look in detail at well, sorry, that's something else.
Don't show that slide.
If you look in detail at the impact of the sun, for example, the sun's input, total energy is doing this, and the total energy and temperature rise of the Earth is doing this. They simply are decoupled. Clouds are important, but we understand clouds well enough now to know that the clouds have a small effect, but certainly nothing like the effect he mentioned. So basically, he mixes together fact with fiction, and it's very difficult to sort those out unless you happen to know the science. So it's hard to know what to do with his podcasts except just to make sure that you always insist that you get the full picture, not just a piece of the picture. Thank you, loves. Good.
Ben, thank you so much. One point that Cal does make that I think we ought to be thinking about: transitioning to renewable sources of energy, non-pollutants, costs something. They cost more than, a gas engine car, an electric car does. Solar panels cost something. His big concern is that this will be a heavy burden on the poor. We've made the point, I think, all throughout this, that so does climate change, right? I think that's an opportunity for the church also, to come alongside those who can't afford, to winterize their home, can't afford to, and it sounds like that's what Trinity's doing. We have done things like this as well, for the church to come alongside and partner and say, we will help. This is an important mandate and an important way of expressing love for one another. So thank you all very much. I'm going to cut the live stream. Thank you for those who were watching. And yes, next week Ashley is on, right?
Yep.
Good. Thought I had it straight in my
And I'll
head.
have a special, not to bribe you, but I do have a special surprise. Come and see what it is. We're talking about worship in the Old Testament.
Oh, really?
So we interrupted our series on major themes of the Old Testament for the race discussion, and then this one, and now we're jumping back in to finish off major themes of the Old Testament. And that's where Ashley is picking up next week. If you want to ask about that, we can talk about that later. All right. You don't have to move this way to move this way. That's all I would say.
That's open.
So, all right. Have a great week.
Thank you, Dan.
Don't forget Luke, he'll be waiting in the office afterwards.
Okay.
Okay?
Yes.
See you later.